what happened to Dan Henderson? One of the toughest and most iconic fighters in MMA history.
Flattened him with that right hand. He was out cold.
But where did his journey lead him after those legendary knockouts and title belts? Today, we dive deep into the career of one of MMA's most respected fighters. From Olympic wrestler to a feared knockout artist, let's uncover what made Dan Henderson a true legend. Who was Dan Henderson, and why was he so beloved? As a kid, Dan didn't grow up with dreams of being an MMA superstar. There was no UFC for him to aspire to back then. Instead, like so many American kids, he was captivated by the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. Watching those athletes compete lit a fire in young Dan. Wrestling became his obsession. By the time he was a teenager, he wasn't just good at wrestling, he was a prodigy. He fought his way through high school, becoming a California state champion, and eventually moved on to compete at the highest level, representing the US in Greco-Roman wrestling at the 1992 and 1996 Olympics. Now here's where things get interesting. You would think a two-time Olympian would be satisfied with that accomplishment, right? Well, not Dan Henderson. The guy had bigger aspirations. He wanted to fight. When the world of mixed martial arts started to explode in the mid-90s, Hendo knew he had the skills to make an impact. Wrestling had been his bread and butter, but he wasn't going into MMA just to grapple. Oh no, Dan Henderson was about to show the world that he had dynamite in his hands. From the moment Hendo stepped into the MMA world, he was a different breed. In 1997, Dan entered the Brazil Open, his first major MMA tournament, and he fought his way to victory. It wasn't pretty. He didn't have the striking finesse of a kickboxer or the submission wizardry of a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, but he had heart, toughness, and that raw wrestling power. He won the whole tournament, and just like that, Hendo had arrived. Now, what made Henderson so beloved? It wasn't just his wins or his incredible wrestling background. It was his attitude. Dan Henderson was no-nonsense blue-collar fighter who let his performances do the talking. Fans love fighters who are willing to put it all on the line every time they step into the cage. And Hendo epitomized that mindset. He fought for himself, his family, and his pride. And when you saw Dan fight, you knew you were going to see a war.
Leverage points. Yeah, it's just, when you think back, like as a pioneer in the sport, I mean, it's pretty wild what you guys did. Pretty wild that you entered into the sport that at the time was just kind of a way to make some money.
Right.
It wasn't, I mean, when I started doing the post-fight interviews, it was banned from cable. The only way you could get it was DirecTV. I actually got DirecTV.
That's when you started?
Yeah, 97.
Another reason that fans adored him was his willingness to fight anyone, anywhere, anytime. It didn't matter if it was a smaller guy at 185 pounds or a heavyweight giant. Hendo never backed down. And if you look through his fight history, it is like a who's who of MMA legends. Wanderlei Silva, Fedor Emelianenko, Michael Bisping, Anderson Silva, Quentin Rampage Jackson. The list just goes on. And let's not forget about that right hand. The H-bomb became legendary because of its devastating power. Dan might not have had the speed or the flashiness of some strikers, but if he landed that overhand right, it was lights out. And the fans loved every second of it. Even in his 40s, when most fighters are winding down or already retired, Dan Henderson was still knocking people out cold with that sledgehammer of a punch. More than anything, Dan was respected. He wasn't the guy to talk trash or disrespect his opponent. He simply showed up, fought like a warrior, and let his hands do the talking. That's the kind of attitude that resonates with fight fans. No drama, no gimmicks, just pure, unfiltered fighting spirit. His iconic rivalries. A fighter is only as good as the fighters that he faces, and boy did Hendo have his fair share of iconic fights and rivalries that made him the great that he is today. Number 1, Wanderlei Silva. Where better to start off his list of rivalries than when he faced Wanderlei Silva in Pride? Now, Wanderlei was a monster in Japan during the early 2000s. With his wild, aggressive style and brutal knockouts, he earned the nickname the Axe Murderer. He seemed unstoppable in Pride. And when he first met Dan in 2000, most people didn't give Hendo much of a shot. Their first fight at Pride 12 was an absolute brawl. Silva, with his aggressive Muay Thai, was the clear favorite, and though he did get the better of Hendo in the decision, Henderson showed the world that he could hang with one of the scariest dudes on the planet. Dan wasn't intimidated. He didn't flinch. He went right after Silva. And even though he lost, it was a war that set up one of the greatest rematches in MMA history. Fast forward to Pride 33 in 2007. This time, there was gold on the line. Silva's middleweight championship. Henderson came into this fight with a mission. He wasn't just looking for redemption. He was looking to knock Wanderlei's head off. And that is exactly what he did. In one of the most memorable knockouts in Pride history, Hendo dropped Silva with a left hook and finished him with ground and pound that sent shockwaves through the MMA world. And with that win, Dan Henderson became the first fighter to hold titles in 2 different weight classes within a major organization. He was now a 2-division champion, and the rivalry with Silva had cemented him as one of the all-time greats. Number 2, Michael Bisping. Now, if there's one Dan Henderson rivalry that every MMA fan knows, it's his rivalry against Michael Bisping. It all started when they were coaches on The Ultimate Fighter, US versus UK. Bisping, never shy about running his mouth, took every opportunity to needle Hendo, mocking him and constantly talking trash. For Henderson, a quiet, no-nonsense guy, this didn't sit very well. By the time UFC 100 rolled around in 2009, the tension between the two was at an all-time high. Bisping talked a lot of smack leading up to the fight, but Hendo didn't let it get to him. He was locked in, and when the cage door closed, it was all business. In the second round, Henderson landed one of the most brutal knockouts in MMA history. An H-bomb that sent Bisping crashing to the canvas out cold. And then, just to make sure, Hendo followed up with a flying forearm to his unconscious opponent, a moment that instantly became iconic. Fans still talk about that KO as one of the most devastating finishes ever. But the rivalry didn't end there. Years later, the two would meet again, but more on that later in this video. Number 3, Fedor Emelianenko. One of the fights that defined Henderson's legacy was his fight against the legendary Fedor Emelianenko. By 2011, Fedor was considered one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. The last emperor had dominated the Pride heavyweight division for years. And when the fight was announced, most people thought Henderson, who was much smaller, didn't stand a chance. But Hendo had other plans. In a fight that is still talked about today, Dan knocked Fedor out in the first round. That's right, the man that many considered unbeatable was stopped by the smaller and older Dan Henderson. It was a career-defining moment, not just for Hendo, but for MMA as a whole. It proved that in this sport, anything can happen and legends can fall. The controversy surrounding Dan Henderson. Now, Dan Henderson wasn't a fighter who thrived on controversy, but there were a few moments in his career that stirred up the MMA world. Number 1, the extra shot on Michael Bisping at UFC 100. For example, one of the most talked about moments in Dan Henderson's career came at UFC 100 after his knockout of Michael Bisping. When Hendo landed that iconic right hand that put Bisping to sleep, fans erupted. But it was the follow-up shot, an airborne forearm smash to an already unconscious Bisping, that had everyone talking. Critics were quick to call it unnecessary. Bisping was clearly out, so why the extra shot? When asked about it afterward, Henderson didn't mince words. He admitted it wasn't necessary, but said that last punch was just to shut him up. For fans who had watched Bisping trash talk Henderson throughout The Ultimate Fighter, that final punch was poetic justice. Hendo's unapologetic response only added to his legendary status. It was the kind of old-school, take-no-prisoners attitude that made him so beloved by fans. While some criticized the move as unsportsmanlike, many more saw it as Henderson simply sending a message. If you run your mouth, you better be ready to back it up.
flattened him with that right hand. I mean, he was out cold, and then you launched yourself through the air and smashed him with that right hand.
Yeah.
And it was that, but that becoming your logo was one of the wildest things. I can't believe. I mean, it's a crazy logo. I mean, everyone has to know what that is, because otherwise it wouldn't even make sense. Like, what is he doing?
Right.
Is he about to do a cartwheel? You know what I mean? It's not like, you're throwing a head kick or you're throwing a punch.
Number 2, TRT. The other significant controversy surrounding Dan Henderson came in the form of TRT, or Testosterone Replacement Therapy. In the early 2010s, several fighters, including Henderson, were using TRT legally to enhance their performance as they got older. Hendo was one of the more high-profile names associated with TRT, and while it was within the rules at the time, it sparked debate across the MMA world. Critics argued that TRT gave fighters an unfair advantage, allowing them to recover faster and fight at a level beyond what their natural testosterone levels would allow. The biggest of which was none other than his old rival, Michael Bisping. Henderson, however, was always upfront about his use of TRT. He never hid behind it, and he wasn't afraid to discuss it. But in 2014, the Nevada State Athletic Commission banned TRT, and Henderson, like many others, had to adjust. He continued to fight without TRT, proving that while it may have helped his longevity, his skills and toughness were what really carried him through his career. Even after the ban, Hendo still fought at a high level, taking on top contenders in both the middleweight and light heavyweight division.
Your thoughts, if I may, on this whole testosterone replacement therapy story that's making a lot of headlines in MMA. It was reported that this is something that you take, but always, under the limits, and you're always, kosher, so to speak. Do you feel as though fighters are abusing this right now and taking this as a sort of PED and to gain an advantage over an opponent?
I have no idea about what anyone else is doing. I just know that I'm always real careful and not doing anything that I shouldn't be doing.
How his career ended and what happened to Dan Henderson. With all of the controversies and a career full of iconic rivalries, what happened to Dan Henderson? And how did he end his career? Hendo ended his career in the most appropriate way possible, with a bang and on his shield. In 2016, at the age of 46, an age when most fighters have long since hung up their gloves, Henderson was still competing at the highest level. And not just competing, he was knocking people out. His bout with Hector Lombard at UFC 199 was a classic Hendo performance, a brutal knockout that left fans in awe. But it wasn't just another KO, it was the first time Lombard had been knocked out cold. Even after all these years, Dan was still adding to his highlight reel. But the fight that everyone remembers from Henderson's final days in the UFC is the rematch with Michael Bisping at UFC 204. Bisping, now the UFC middleweight champion, was looking to cement his legacy by avenging his brutal loss to Hendo at UFC 100. Henderson, on the other hand, had one final goal in mind: to win the UFC belt that had eluded him throughout his career. The build-up to the fight was everything that you would expect from a rivalry of this magnitude. Bisping was riding high after knocking out Luke Rockhold to win the belt, and many thought Hendo was too old to be a legitimate threat. But as always, Henderson proved the doubters wrong. The fight took place in Manchester, England, Bisping's backyard. From the opening bell, it was clear that Hendo wasn't just there for a paycheck. He came to take Bisping's head off. In the first round, Henderson landed his signature H-bomb, dropping Bisping and nearly finishing him. The crowd was stunned. Even though Bisping survived, the damage was done. His face was a bloody mess and the fight was far from over. In the second round, Henderson did it again, dropping Bisping with another right hand. But somehow, Bisping held on. As the fight went on, Bisping's technical striking began to take over, and he outpointed Henderson in the later rounds. After 5 rounds of brutal action, the judges awarded Bisping the win via unanimous decision. The decision was controversial to say the least. Many fans and analysts believe that Henderson had done enough to win, especially with the 2 knockdowns. But as always, Hendo took the loss with class. He didn't complain or make excuses. He simply acknowledged that it wasn't his night and then announced his retirement from MMA. This ended up being Henderson's last MMA fight, and what a way to go out. At 46 years old, Dan Henderson walked away from the sport with his head held high. He may not have captured the UFC belt, but his legacy was already secure. Hendo had fought the best of the best, from heavyweights to middleweights, and he had beaten some of the greatest fighters in MMA history.
So, this is the last fight on my current contract. We'll see what happens after that. It's a possibility. I'll be retiring soon. I don't know, after 2, 3 more, or maybe this is the last one. I have no idea. It's just, it all depends on how I feel after this fight, and I'm still going to be involved in the sport and helping to build it even bigger than it is now.
What is Hendo up to now? After hanging up the gloves in 2016, Dan Henderson didn't just fade away like some fighters do. He took the same energy and work ethic that made him a legend in MMA and channeled it into building a life outside of the cage. Distinguished by his ferocity in the ring and his humility outside of it, Henderson transitioned into a successful businessman, coach, and author, while continuing to inspire the next generation of fighters and fitness enthusiasts. Henderson co-founded the iconic Team Quest Fight Club with Randy Couture back in 2000, an early breeding ground for MMA talent. While his involvement with Team Quest faced some legal issues, including a trademark dispute with former teammate Matt Lindland in 2011, Henderson shifted his focus to establishing his own legacy in fitness. He opened Dan Henderson's Athletic Fitness Center in Temecula, California. In 2012, the gym has since grown into a 15,000 square foot facility that offers everything from MMA training to strength conditioning, Muay Thai, Jiu-Jitsu, and even yoga. Hendo himself is there every weekday, coaching and maintaining a hands-on approach. For him, it's not just about running a gym, it's about building a community. But Dan's ambitions didn't stop with just the gym. He recently published an autobiography titled Hendo, The American Athlete in 2023. The book takes readers through his incredible career and the life lessons that he learned along the way. Henderson credits his father Bill for instilling the mental toughness that carried him throughout his career. "My dad made me who I am, mentally strong and resilient," Henderson stated, reflecting on his father's passing in 2023. Always evolving, Henderson is now working on opening Hendo's Barrel House, a restaurant, bar, and distillery in Temecula. Set to open soon, it is another way that Hendo is staying connected to his community, building not just businesses, but relationships. "I love this area," he says. "My kids grew up here, and I want to keep creating something special." Now, Dan Henderson may have left the octagon, but his legacy continues to grow beyond the sport that made him a household name. Whether it's through his gym, his book, or his new restaurant, Hendo remains an inspiration. Proof that the fighter spirit never truly fades.